So let's talk about the first mountain, taper hell. Now, taper hell is the inevitable mountain, the biggest mountain, right? It's the mountain that we realized there was a problem and now we're tapering off a drug. Hopefully with the help of our psychiatrists or psychologists, and hopefully utilizing the Ashton manual, which states to go about 1 milligram per 2 weeks to a month. The idea is to slowly taper and allow your body and your mind and your emotions to sort of adjust to the process. You go too fast, poor outcomes. Meaning you're more likely to go back on the drug, or you're going to start medicating with other drugs like alcohol, or you're probably going to get on a third drug like an antidepressant or something to that effect. Now, the first mountain is the longest mountain. It could take anywhere from 6 months to 2 or 3 years to come off the drug, depending on how long you've been on it and how hard it is for you. And everybody's different. We must remember that. I've heard stories where people were on high dosage and came off in months and did very well. I've heard stories where people were on small dosages and it took them years to come off, and a couple years later they still were going through symptoms. Although I have my hypothesis on those certain situations, but we'll talk about that in another video. So the first mountain is taper hell. It's just simply tapering off the drug and getting back to a point where you're drug-free from the benzo. Getting to a point where it's no longer causing chemical warfare on your neurological system. So that's the obvious mountain, but now let's look at the second mountain, manifesting conditions. This is probably the least obvious mountain. And what is manifesting symptoms? Well, what I mean is when you're in a state of intense trauma, like is the case when you're coming off benzo, of course, you're going through all these different symptoms. You probably can't work. You're probably a stress on your family and your relationships. And you're probably laying in bed with a dozen or more symptoms that feel like sheer hell. You're fighting depression and anxiety and panic. And really it's trauma. And I don't think they've linked this yet, but I'm pretty sure they're going to come close to it, if not have definitive proof that sustained states of benzo withdrawal can quite literally lead to PTSD, stemming from all the time you spent in sheer hell. I mean, why would that not be the case? So let's look at manifesting conditions. PTSD aside, that may or may not exist, but here's what does exist. Major depression. This is why you can't get out of bed. This is why you feel fatigued, foggy-headed, agitated. And another thing that often happens is you develop agoraphobia, meaning you're afraid to leave the house. Walking out to the mailbox or trying to drive to the store could cause panic attacks. This happens all too often. People just think it's part of the withdrawal, when in fact it's not. And what happens is when you come off the drug, you're sort of left with these things. So the best thing you can do is try to mitigate or reduce these manifesting conditions along the way. Now, how bad can manifesting conditions get? I don't want to scare you, but suicidal ideation and suicide is a major risk. So mountain 3. Now this mountain oftentimes doesn't affect everyone. Some people come off the drug, they have a little bit of withdrawal, and usually they have an adjustment period, but they do pretty well. For others, up to 2, 3, 4, 5 years after the drug, they're still having what they call post-withdrawal syndrome. Simply put, symptoms of withdrawal manifesting or still remaining long after the person's come off the drug entirely. We don't see this with other drugs. You don't see a heroin addict that comes off heroin and for the next 2 years still is going through heroin withdrawal. Of course, if you're going through benzo recovery, we're fighting a war. We're trying to get psychiatrists and medical doctors and many people in the professional health industry to take notice that there's a real phenomenon here. Okay, so here's the fourth mountain of benzo recovery, and I think this one is one of the most important, and again, it's one of the most overlooked, and that is addressing the pre-existing condition. Many people I talk to, and I've talked to hundreds, maybe thousands of people going through benzo recovery, and I'm always shocked and sort of taken back by how many of them seem to think that because they took benzodiazepine, that somehow that cured their pre-existing condition, and now they just have to deal with the benzo. But that's unfortunately not the case. The benzo didn't cure your anxiety, it just sort of masked it. It just sort of put a band-aid over it and helped you get back to your life.